Construction is basically something that sits at the very core of what Drawabox is. And it wasn't always that way. When I started Drawabox, I basically was regurgitating a lot of what I had learned from my own instructors. And as I steadily did more and more critiques for students, I mean, I've done thousands at this point. I think I've probably exceeded 4,000 now. I learned a great deal of how my students think and how I think. And I learned to express how I think through these spatial problems in a way that kind of took what I had learned and really solidified it into something that felt more clear, at least to me. And I feel like I've seen the benefits of that in my students' work. So we're going to talk a little bit about what construction is, the methodology behind it, and I'm going to show you a quick example of how it's employed. Construction is all about the idea that when we draw, we always start out simple. We start out with simple three-dimensional forms rather than jumping right into a lot of the complexity that is present in whatever object we're trying to draw. So we always start simple, and then in successive passes over what we're drawing, we gradually build on top of what we've constructed until eventually we get to something much more complex. And I'll show you what I mean. It's a lot like when you see a building going up. That building first needs a foundation, and then it needs a scaffolding, and then gradually the more complicated elements of that construction go up. But at every point during this process, there's enough there to keep the whole thing from toppling over. At no point do you ever build up to be really complex and then build your support structure. You're always moving in a way that everything that you add is already going to be supported by what's already present. That's exactly what we do in construction. Now, the question is, if you're setting out to draw something, how do you know which forms to employ? And the answer to that is we observe. So if you look at this example, this is a mushroom. Sorry for how blown out the image is. I had to do some minor modifications to it. But in essence, what you have here is a cylindrical stalk and then a cap, which is also not quite cylindrical. It's more of a cone, but it's rounded at the top. And you've got these kind of frills that come out. And let's get a different color. They kind of flow out like this, kind of like the bottom of a dress. And so we do know that this bell shape connects somewhere with this cylinder here. And for the most part, that's all it really is. It's really just a bell with some flare stuck on top of a cylinder. Using that information, we now know how we can construct at least the basic scaffolding for this object. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Oops. So we start out with a simple cylinder. And I explained this in the 250 cylinder challenge, but basically a cylinder has a minor axis that runs through both ellipses. Similar to the organic forms exercises, you basically just got these ellipses aligned to a singular continuous minor axis. This isn't a rigid cylinder, it's more of a flexible tube, but it still has a continuous flowing line that aligns all of its cross sections. Now that we have this cylinder in place, because we've been practicing building up these simple forms, so these are all concepts that build on top of each other, we can then place the bell form. And while this mushroom may actually not be configured like this in reality, perhaps the bell is actually solid inside, and maybe the cylinder connects down here. But that doesn't actually matter all that much. Instead, as long as you kind of craft an understanding that these two things connect somewhere, and that there is some sort of a relationship between them, it's not really going to impede your ability to depict the whole object, and to do so while maintaining the illusion of form. We do know that it connects to this bell somewhere up here, whether it's down here or all the way up here is kind of irrelevant. We just want to make sure that these things fit together and that the forms relate to one another. Now that we have this basic scaffolding in place, the constructional method builds on top of this. So this would have been our first phase, and we made sure to understand that every single form that we put down, of which there are only two, we did what we needed to in order to reinforce the illusion for ourselves that these forms are solid and three-dimensional. Whether that means adding contour curves or contour ellipses, whatever was necessary was put in there. And we didn't go overboard with contour lines or anything. We just added what was needed, and we made sure that what we added was drawn carefully and with a degree of control. So you don't want to just be, adding a bunch of sloppily drawn contour lines just for the hell of it. You need to think about what each line is going to contribute to your drawing. So the next step would be to start building on top of this scaffolding. Now, this kind of information is a lot more complex. Without the scaffolding underneath, we'd be solving a number of different problems all at once. But because we started off with the scaffolding to solve a lot of the bigger problems, we now know exactly how these ridges here would flow. We don't have to worry about the fact that they're going around in a circle because we've already constructed that circle. We just need to adhere to the form that we already dropped in there. Whereas if we were doing it just, trying to watch that directly and just draw how the frill sits in space without any underlying scaffolding, we are now trying to solve both the problem of how these ridges kind of go in and out, but also how the whole thing curves around the overall bell. With the bell already constructed, those problems are solved. There are a few problems, however, that I see a lot in students when they're trying to employ this. And it really hinges on the idea that construction is about breaking a very complicated problem into a number of smaller decisions being made. So let's say you were drawing a flower, and that flower had petals. We'll actually be covering this a great deal more in lesson 3, but all you need to pay attention to is this outer circle. I started drawing that out because I was defining the bounds to which my petals would reach. That is a decision that was made. And now that that decision has been made, I don't want to get caught up in making that decision again or changing it. So I would do my best to make sure that these lines here, which are going to represent the flow of each petal that I draw, I want to make sure that it reaches only as far as this bounds ellipse. I don't want them going further. I don't want them coming up short. I don't want to now be making another decision on top of it. And so when I create my petals, I already know how far they need to go. Drawing through your forms here is also very important because construction is all about your understanding of how these forms sit in space. And so I kept to that decision. Now, if I had not, the risk of making a decision multiple times is that some of your drawing is adhering to the old decision and some of it is adhering to the new decision. And as you might remember from one of the previous videos in this lesson, you're telling a lie, and you need to keep your story straight. But if you have multiple changing decisions throughout the whole process, then you are telling two different stories, some adhering to the first decision and some adhering to the second decision. When you've got two conflicting stories, that's where your whole illusion starts to fall apart. So even if your initial decision turns out to have been incorrect, you still should be adhering to it. Even though you're not matching your reference perfectly, that's not a big deal, because you're still fighting to keep that illusion solid. That's something that a lot of students don't quite grasp the first time around, that you're not here to just reproduce and copy your reference image. You're here to construct it, which means your goal is not to create an identical copy, but rather to communicate what it is. And so if that flower's petals go further out or are aligned in a different way, a different instance of that flower could still have a different, larger petals or smaller petals or whatever. And so you're still within the realm of believability to draw that same flower, but with slightly different petals. If it's, it's enough to stay within the bounds of reason. But even if it isn't, if you've already lost that battle, you should still be fighting to keep your plant, as a plant in general, believable. And if you start having multiple conflicting stories within the same construction, that believability goes out the window and the construction no longer feels solid. And that is where you lose the battle. So when you're thinking about all the steps for construction, think of it as though you are making these decisions and you're kind of setting your story in stone. And once you've done that, you have to stick to it all the way through, even if it starts tending away from your intended result. As always, we make mistakes. We make them all the time and we grow from them. But you still want to, above all, reinforce your ability to stick to one story. There's one other thing that I want to address and really drive home before I finish off this video. And that's the idea that every single phase of construction, once you're done with that phase, you should be confident in your belief that the forms that you've drawn feel three-dimensional. If they still feel flat, then you need to do what you can to make sure that they go back to feeling solid. Because after that point, you're not going to be able to go back and really imbue them with solidity after the fact easily. So what I mean is, let's say we are drawing an animal of some sort. At this point, if you don't feel confident that these things are not circles, but rather, ellipses, but if you're not confident that they feel like solid forms, then you need to go back in and add maybe a contour line or something to really reinforce that illusion for yourself. Because if you don't believe it, then the decisions you make are not going to sell the illusion. I often find that these little kind of contour ellipses that sit on the pole of a sphere or a ball can be quite convincing. And so you see, I'm adding this contour line here because I want to feel confident that I believe this kind of sausage form that I'm building for my torso actually feels 3D, so it doesn't feel flat. Because the whole way through, you need to maintain your own belief in this illusion. Because it's very easy to start taking shortcuts and falling away from what you were ultimately aiming to achieve. Because if you start taking shortcuts without really realizing how it impacts the overall three-dimensional illusion you're trying to create, then you can really end up in a pickle. I'm not actually working from reference here, I'm just kind of noodling, but hopefully you get the idea of what I mean. I'm able to keep moving forward with this because I feel that this ball here is 3D. And as you see how I added the muzzle, I wrapped it around because I believed that the sphere was 3D and that this boxy muzzle thing is also three-dimensional. And so as a result, I don't have any trouble in understanding how they fit together. Anyway, I'm going to leave that alone. Hopefully this covered the basic concepts of construction. I don't by any means expect you to understand construction just yet, because that's why the next, 5 lessons all deal with construction being applied to different kinds of subject matter. Keep in mind, those lessons like plants, insects and arachnids, animals, everyday objects, and vehicles, they're not about learning to draw that specific subject matter. It's still focusing on learning how to use construction and using different subjects as different angles in which to tackle that problem. So if you go into those lessons and you start drawing that subject matter and focusing just on that, you're not going to be getting what's intended out of the lesson. It's all about applying construction, because it's something that takes a good deal of time and practice and mileage to really wrap your head around. The exercises for this section are going to focus on taking simple three-dimensional forms and kind of mushing them together or piling them on top of each other to really understand how they relate to one another. So far, we've only really been creating one-off three-dimensional forms, often in the same scene, but they haven't really been touching or interacting with each other. So that's going to be a big step, and it's frequently a difficult one. So be sure to follow the instructions and make sure that you read through the lesson page for this video, which is linked in the description, so that you kind of reinforce what you heard here.